Hello everybody and welcome back again. Now that the final shape release grind has wound down a little bit, I am back with a new video. Today I want to look at the exotic class items that have been added with the dual destiny activity and just some of my favorite combos for each class in the builds I've been running with them. Before we get started though, if you liked this video or found it helpful, go ahead and like and subscribe are always greatly appreciated. And if you'd like to let me know in the comments down below what some of your favorite combos are, I'd love to hear from y'all. Because again, these aren't necessarily the best combos in the game outright, but they're some of my favorites and ones that I've felt like are very, very good. I'm just some guy on the internet, so if you have a combo that I didn't mention here that you think's really good, I'd love to hear that down below in the comments. But before we go ahead and get started, thank you for watching. Let's go ahead and begin. Now, the one thing I want to mention, just as like some general info about these, is that the big thing to keep in mind with the exotic class items is that while they do roll with two different exotic perks, each perk is generally a bit weaker than its standard counterpart. Some of them have some functionality removed, like how Spirit of the Assassin only grants Assassin Cal's invisibility and not its healing, and some are numbers nerfs, like how Spirit of the Wormhusk gives about half of Wormhusk Crown's healing buff, as opposed to, the full amount that Wormhusk Crown would give you. This is, I believe, just so that these don't power creep out their original versions, but instead let you mix and match parts of them that were not necessarily the most used before, and just try to give some exotic perks some new life. And in general, I think Bungie did do a decent job of that. Some, however, like Syntheseps, have both reduced. Syntheseps does give melee and super damage, as well as weapon handling and reload speed while surrounded. The Spirit of the Syntheseps gives a little bit less melee damage and does not give any super damage or weapon stats at all while surrounded. So in general, I found that my best success with exotic class items usually, but not always, came when I specifically looked for perks that provide some kind of double value. For example, when pairing Apotheosis and Star Eaters on Warlock, the damage output when I popped my super was nice, but you have to think about how each perk is a slightly less effective version of its original counterpart, so these types of combos didn't necessarily perform quite as well as just using one of their originals. I know Apotheosis Star Eater does actually look like a pretty good combo. It's definitely not bad, but it was not one of my favorites. I've got something else that I actually liked a bit more. Now, in some cases, the originals aren't available in a certain class, like Star Eaters for Warlocks and Titans, so those combos can often be your only choice, and naturally you may want to double down on one part of the build, like how Star Eaters and Apotheosis will let your super do more damage and then also give grenade regen right after for more damage output. It wouldn't be as good on something that doesn't necessarily need to do super damage output, like if you wanted to run Winter's Wrath and then you wanted to have your grenades after. But for something like Nova Bomb, then you get to throw some storm grenades. I feel like that's a pretty good combo. I did feel like the builds were usually, but not always, stronger when playing to two different aspects of the kit though. However, the thing to keep in mind is that the class items and prismatic subclasses as a whole are very customizable by their nature, so what I liked and what I found success with may differ from what you like and have found good success with. However, pretty much for all three classes, I felt that if I wanted to lean really hard into one ability, like my super for example, that I was often better off using a different exotic that did what I wanted, but stronger, because it had the full functionality of an entire exotic armor piece. But it did depend quite a bit on what exotic class item perks were available for each class, as while all the perks are not the full exotic effects from the armor that they are pulled from, some are more effective than others. And we'll go ahead and just start with the Warlock, and I do think there are some very solid options here. The two favorites that I found were combos of Necrotic Grips with Star Eaters, and then my absolute favorite out of the ones that I tested here and played with were a combo of Verity and Inmost Light Spirits. When running Star Eaters, you can get your Nova Bomb or Needle Storm up to some pretty decent damage territory. And from my testing, Nova Bomb was a little bit higher than Needle Storm because it did get buffed in Final Shape, hitting around the 800k damage ballpark if all Seekers made their way back to the original target, and you had a weaken effect, which is pretty easy to get in the Prismatic subclass, compared to about 600k for Needle Storm in the same way. Part of that is just because Nova Bomb does so much damage so quickly, and Needle Storm is going to be a little trickier to get the same amount of damage out of on Prismatic specifically. But do be careful with Nova Bomb specifically, because it can still actually block your teammates' bullets due to an old behavior that it has from several years ago that has now been removed. But Nova Bomb at one point could be shot manually to detonate it early, and that behavior is still in the game. Although it won't detonate the Nova Bomb, it will still block shots. You can't shoot through it, it will absorb any bullets shot towards it. I did like Necrotics more than most of the other perks, but a big part of that is because when I play Prismatic Warlock, I basically always use Arcane Needle as my Prismatic Warlock melee, and the tick damage on Necrotic can then proc the Unravel that Arcane Needle applies, essentially helping build into your DOT effects. The poison will then pop the Unravel, which will just do more damage over time. You could also run your primary weapon as a weapon of sorrow like Osteostriga, Thorn, or the recently buffed Necrochasm in order to get even more value out of your poison. You don't even need to necessarily run a weapon of sorrow, but it does help spread more poison, and ticking damage on multiple targets is very good for getting your super back even faster, because remember, Star Eaters on the class items does not have the Hunter Star Eaters effect of giving you more super energy for each orb you pick up. So you will be dealing with your normal super cooldown, and for something like Nova Bomb, you may want to have a way to damage multiple targets and get your super back even faster. The build I usually opted for with my Nova Bomb setup is here on the screen now if you'd like to copy it, and just know that I run pretty much the same setup for Needle Storm if I need to not block shots with Nova Bomb, but obviously just switching out the super for Needle Storm, and the weapons can obviously be changed if needed. For the more neutral grenade build, I liked running Spirit of Verity with Spirit of Inmost Light. Spirit of Ozymancy is also very good here because of the amount of grenade energy that it can refund even on non-cold snap grenades. However, with Devour and Inmost Light, I felt like I was getting way more grenade energy back than I really needed, and so I didn't really feel like Ozymancy was giving me nearly as much. I was still able to have my grenades on sub 10-second cooldowns with Devour and Inmost Light paired together. I did swap the grenades here between Storm and Vortex, depending on what type of damage I was going to be doing to proc the Death Throes perk on the Spirit of Verity. Although the Threadling grenade was okay too if I was using strand weapons, it was just not nearly as good as Storm or Vortex. So if I was running something like Forbearance, I would do Storm. If I was running something like Harsh Language, Wave Frame, Void, I would do Vortex. For Storm Grenade, you have options like Indebted Kindness Rocket Sidearm, the Forbearance Waveframe Grenade Launcher with Chain Reaction, or just even a good primary with Volt Shot. And then on Vortex, a good Void primary like Unforgiven or Recluse was my usual go-to. If I needed a heavy, something like Commemoration as an LMG was really good, or the good old Harsh Language Waveframe Grenade Launcher if you have a good one. It can roll to Stabilizing Rounds, which was quite nice when trying to stack Death Throws for a Void Grenade. That's all I got for Warlocks, though, so that build, again, is on screen if you want to copy it or change anything from it. This is the more neutral game, grenade-oriented one. And yeah, for my Titans out there, though, I liked a few different options, although it was definitely more narrow than I felt I was able to do with the other two classes. And your class item combos are going to be popping up on screen, just my favorite perks that I used. For my first column, I definitely think my number one favorite was 100% Spirit of Inmost Light. It's been a very strong Titan exotic for a while as Heart of the Inmost Light, and while it doesn't give any extra damage to your abilities here like Heart of Inmost Light does, the regen is still very, very good. And for the second column, I think that Syntheseps were my favorite by far. Star Eaters aren't bad in theory either, but Titan Supers typically are very strong against bosses on paper and weaker in practice in my experience, although it kind of just depends on the boss specifically. Although Twilight Arsenal with Star Eaters isn't bad at all. However, for a lot of bosses where you can get in close enough to really use a Titan Super, you may be better off using normal Synthoseps, which give a bigger buff than Star Eaters to your super damage as long as you are able to stay surrounded. So that's kind of why I didn't really lean towards Star Eaters for my Titan. It's definitely not bad though, because you could do something like Twilight Arsenal against a boss that's a bit further out with Star Eaters, because Syntheseps are an all or nothing kind of thing, and Star Eaters are not dependent on you being surrounded, which sometimes is a factor you cannot control during an encounter. My other favorites for Titans was something like Spirit of Scars, because the regen is very nice. That one basically took the best part of Precious Scars and then let you have another perk with it without wasting part of your functionality on a perk that would require your teammates to die. The restoration half of Precious Scars is extremely good, and sticking it on the class item I think was a good change. I also want to throw a little honorable mention to Spirit of Contact, but for my builds, I definitely felt like Spirit of Syntheseps held much more value because I was often doing a triple consecration setup with knockout for my Prismatic Titan. When running my consecration setup, I actually did Spirit of Hoarfrost in my first instead of Inmost Light for this specifically, because when you pop your barricade, when the crystals pop up, it will apply slow and freeze to surrounding enemies, and that lets you use Facet of Courage to get an extra 10% damage out of it, as well as shattering some stasis crystals, although currently Consecration is a little inconsistent with its stasis shatter. I believe it's probably bugged, and I think it will get addressed in a future update because they did say that they wanted a lot of the light abilities on Prismatic to be able to shatter things like stasis crystals, but currently it's not super consistent with Prismatic. I did also like running Monte Carlo here to get my melee charges back easier, but it's definitely not required because you will be able to get quite a bit of damage using something like Facet of Courage with that stasis slow to get an extra 10% damage. And Monte Carlo is really just a melee regen kind of thing, but with several other mods in your armor, you can get your melee regen up pretty independent of Monte Carlo if you don't like Monte Carlo, don't have Monte Carlo, or just don't want to use it because you have a different weapon somewhere else. Unfortunately, not much else really stood out to me with my Titan builds on these class items. A lot of the exotic perks here either aren't great on Prismatic in my opinion, or I'd rather have their original versions for parts of the perk that were removed in the class item versions. I feel like there are probably some other good Titan builds out there. I didn't get a ton of diverse combos compared to my other two characters, even though I farmed for them. I got a lot of repeats here, and a lot of the perks I tested didn't necessarily strike my interest the way that a lot of the other classes did. So sorry about that if I missed something, but again, let me know in the comments down below if you've got a Titan class item that you think is really, really good. Alright, and last but certainly not least, I want to talk about my Hunter class items out there. There's quite a bit that I do like here. I like Syntheseps on these as well, as you can use it with Combination Blow, one of the strongest melee attacks in the game, and you can also use Spirit of the Lyre with Combination Blow to get some big damage. In my general experience, I will say Spirit of the Lyre was better if you didn't want to try doing Grapple Melee build, since Syntheseps does work pretty consistently with Grapple Melee, but Lyre seems to not as much. It kind of depends on being the Arc Melee. But Lyre's Handshake will give you overall more damage, but Syntheseps will also work with a mobility option like Grapple Melee, just because of how the rhythm of Lyre's Handshake has to be used. I do think that the Lyre perk is better, but Syntheseps will also work with 1-2 punch shotguns a bit better for Grapple Melee than it will with Lyre's, and I'll talk about something in a minute about the Lyre's Handshake combo, just because I do think it's probably not going to be the best for very long. And yeah, I'm going to go ahead and put my Hunter Melee build on the screen now if you want to copy or change it. This is the exact same one that I used for Syntho and Lyre's, so you can always just swap that if you'd like. If I was on Syntheseps, I used Navigator to essentially do a Hunter version of the Grapple Melee Titan build, where you would pop the grapple point with the Catalyst, grapple to it to get your grapple back, use your Grapple Melee, and it would let you chain grapples together. You don't have to do that, but it is very nice if you want to use Synthos with Grapple Melee. So if you swap to Lyre's, you won't need the Navigator, basically. As a side note, these combos are currently dealing pretty insane damage, so while I do think they are the best at the moment for Hunters, I also expect that they will probably get nerfed like other Combination Blow interactions have in the past. There's a reason they've taken heavy swings stacking melee buffs in the past, so don't get too surprised if this gets hit in a balance patch within a month or two, because you've got things stacking like crazy, and then you can also think about Facet of Courage, where you're getting an extra 10% on top of that, and that's part of how melee Hunters right now are doing such insane levels of damage. I would not bank on them doing that for too much longer, just because there's a decent chance that it will get nerfed like other melee stacking things have in the past. The other perks that I did like for my Hunter builds, however, were mostly neutral game or clearing focused if you don't want to go for something like a melee build. Trying to use the Star Eater's Spirit for a super is okay, but generally a damage-based Hunter super setup is probably going to opt for Nighthawk at the moment, which is still very great with Prismatic since you get the correct Golden Gun for Nighthawk and Facet of Courage for 10% extra damage against Darkness debuffed enemies. And one of your better melees when you're not doing the melee build is the Stasis Shuriken, which will apply a Darkness debuff to give you an extra 10% on your Golden Gun. So I didn't really use Star Eaters that much for my Hunter on my class items. A great combo that I did love, however, was Wormhusk with Galanor, if I wanted to have something essentially playing into a super in some ways. I would run either Silence and Squall for the super or Silk Strike for the super, and then basically the rest of the build was personal preference. For something like the first or third encounter of the new raid, when Contest was active, roaming supers were very nice to have to clear the rooms. And I actually really would have loved to have my Galanor class item over that weekend to have more uptime on Silk Strike, especially for that first encounter where you could pop a roaming super and then clear several rooms at once with it, because you can get up to 50% of your super cooldown back attack based on kills and hits, and Silk Strike lasts quite a while, so getting 50% is pretty common, especially with the sweeping spin attack. You can hit and kill a lot of enemies that it is pretty easy to get that whole 50% back. Silence and Squall also ticks very fast, so it will recharge quite quickly when using the setup from my experience. And then Wormhusk Crown is a bit of a personal preference, the Spirit of Wormhusk, but dodge just has such a low cooldown and is so spammable that it's already used as a survivability tool. If you're in trouble, you can just dodge, try to get away, and having that bump of healing feels very nice. And I was not a huge fan on this setup specifically of any of the other ones, so Wormhusk is just a nice neutral, non-dependent on any other part of the build. You'll always have dodge, you'll always probably be spamming it, so having it for healing was also very nice. You could always use something like Renewals or Caliban though if you'd like to have either a little more utility, or Caliban if you'd like to have a little more damage with powered melee kills causing ignitions. I liked both, I think both are fine. I personally really liked my Wormhusk setup though. That's all I got for today though, so if you like this video or found it helpful, remember to like and subscribe. Do a great job of helping me out. My Twitch channel is going to be linked down below, so if you're interested in catching some streams, always feel free to visit over there. And then last but not least, we're going to start talking about some of the new weapons one at a time. Whenever I get a chance to make videos, I want to start making my way through some of the weapons, just talking about roles I like, things I like about them, or if they're not very good, we'll talk about why they may not be. So that is all I have for this video. Thank you very much for staying this long and listening to my ramblings. Have a great rest of your day. I will not waste any more of y'all time. See ya.